The room went silent the moment the Admiral stood up. Not politely. Not casually. Every chair stopped moving at once like someone had cut the power in the building. The same men who had been laughing at me 5 seconds earlier suddenly looked like schoolboys caught setting fire to a church basement. Admiral Richard Monroe stared across the briefing room at Colonel Bryce Tanner, his jaw tight enough to crack bone. "Colonel," he said slowly, "you will apologize to her, right now." Nobody breathed. Tanner blinked twice, confused, embarrassed, angry. What he muttered. The Admiral took one step forward. "You heard me?" And that was the moment Bryce Tanner realized exactly who I was. An hour earlier, rain had been hitting the windows of Naval Station Norfolk hard enough to sound like gravel. Virginia weather in November had a way of crawling into your joints. Cold, damp, the kind of cold older people feel in old injuries before storms arrive. I parked my rental car beside a line of black government SUVs and sat there for a minute with both hands resting on the steering wheel. I almost drove away. Funny thing about revenge. People imagine it feels hot, burning, powerful. But after enough years, revenge gets cold, heavy, like carrying a wet sea bag uphill. I was 43 years old that morning, widowed for 11 years, retired from military service for almost a decade. And despite all the stories people told about me, despite the whispers, despite the call sign, I was tired. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Dark dress, black coat, hair pinned neatly behind my ears. Not exactly what those men expected from someone called Ironhawk. I stepped out into the rain and walked toward Building C. Inside the hallways smelled exactly the way military buildings always smell: burnt coffee floor polish, old paper, and recycled air. Some things never change. Young sailors passed me without looking twice. A lieutenant at the front desk asked for my credentials. The moment he read my name, his posture straightened. "Yes, ma'am." Still not used to hearing that tone. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The briefing room doors were already open. And that's where everything started. About 15 men sat around a long, polished table. Mostly SEAL officers, commanders, intelligence people, contractors, gray hair on some, scars on others. The kind of room where everybody measures everybody within 3 seconds. The moment I walked in, conversation slowed. Not because they recognized me, because they didn't. To them, I looked like somebody from Washington, maybe legal staff, maybe public affairs. Colonel Bryce Tanner leaned back in his chair near the center of the room, mid-50s, expensive watch, silver oak leaves on his collar, smile sharp as broken glass. I recognized him instantly. Time had thickened him around the neck, but not enough to hide the arrogance. He looked me up and down slowly. Then he smirked. "Well, now," he said loudly enough for everybody to hear. "Nice dress." A few men chuckled. Tanner folded his arms. "You here to brief us?" he asked, "or pour drinks after?" More laughter. Not cruel laughter exactly. Just the kind men use when they want approval from another man. I set my folder down calmly. Then I looked directly at him. Only if it's easier than making a man disappear from a mile away. The laughter stopped unevenly. A couple men exchanged looks. One younger officer actually smiled like he thought I was joking. Tanner leaned forward. "Oh, I like this already," he said. "What's your call sign, Princess?" There it was. Princess? I'd heard worse overseas from men bleeding in the dirt. Still, something about hearing it inside an American briefing room made my stomach tighten. I answered without blinking. "Ironhawk." The room changed instantly. Not dramatically, quietly, which is worse. One commander lowered his coffee cup halfway to the table and forgot to set it down. Another man turned toward me so fast his chair squeaked. And at the far end of the room, Admiral Monroe slowly stood up. His face lost color first. Then Tanner noticed. What Tanner asked with a laugh that sounded thinner now. The Admiral stared at me for a long moment. "You're Evelyn Carter." "Yes, sir." Tanner frowned. Then realization hit him like a truck through ice. Not full understanding. Just enough. Enough to scare him. The Admiral looked at Tanner. "Colonel," he said coldly, "apologized to Commander Carter." Nobody moved. Tanner gave a short laugh. "Come on, Rich, I was joking. Now." The room became painfully still. Tanner looked around, searching for support. Nobody helped him. Finally, he cleared his throat. "My apologies, Commander." I nodded once. "That's fine." But it wasn't fine. Not really. Because standing there looking at Bryce Tanner again after 11 years, I could suddenly smell Afghanistan dust in my memory. Burned metal, jet fuel, blood. And Daniel. Always Daniel. The briefing officially concerned a review board hearing scheduled for later that week. Old operational records. Classified mission disputes. Bureaucratic language wrapped around dead soldiers. But everybody in that room knew the truth. The hearing was about Operation Lantern Pike, the mission that killed my husband, and the mission Bryce Tanner built his career on afterward. Admiral Monroe dismissed the room 10 minutes later. People filed out quietly. Nobody joked anymore. As I gathered my papers, Monroe approached me carefully. He looked older than I remembered, deep lines around the eyes. A man who carried too many funerals inside him. "You should have warned me you were coming in person," he said softly. "I almost didn't." He nodded slowly. "Seeing Tanner rattled was worth it. That wasn't why I came." Monroe studied me. "You still hate him?" The question sat between us a while. Outside thunder rolled across the harbor. Finally I answered honestly, "I don't know anymore." And that frightened me more than hatred ever had. Because for 11 years anger had been the only thing keeping me moving. Without it, I wasn't sure what remained. As I left the building, I noticed Tanner standing alone near the far hallway window watching me. No smile now. No confidence either. Just fear. Good. For the first time in 11 years. Bryce Tanner understood the past had finally come back for him. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, but the wind still rattled the hotel windows overlooking the Elizabeth River. Norfolk looked gray and tired under the streetlights. Cargo cranes stood motionless in the harbor, like giant skeletons frozen in place. I sat at the small desk in my room wearing an old navy sweatshirt and stared at a photograph I hadn't touched in years. Daniel. He was laughing in the picture. That was the first thing people always noticed about him. Not the medals, not the size of him, not even the confidence. The laugh. Daniel Carter laughed like life was still worth trusting. I used to envy that about him. The photograph had been taken outside a diner in Oceanside, California, sometime before our last deployment together. We were younger then, sunburned, exhausted, happy in the careless way military couples sometimes are before reality catches up to them. Back before Operation Lantern Pike buried half our lives. I rubbed my thumb across the edge of the picture and closed my eyes. And just like that, I was back in Afghanistan again. The mountains near Coast Province looked beautiful from a distance. That's the lie war tells you first. Sunrise would hit those cliffs in shades of gold and orange, so perfect it almost looked painted. Then the shooting started and reminded everybody where they really were. Daniel and I had been attached to Joint Special Operations Command for almost 3 years by then. Different assignments, different specialties, same war. I worked long-range reconnaissance and sniper overwatch. Daniel handled extraction coordination and tactical movement. We understood each other in ways civilian marriages rarely understand. When you've watched somebody clean blood off their boots at 2 a.m, you stop wasting time pretending life is simple. Operation Lantern Pike began as a hostage rescue. 2 American aid workers had been taken near the Pakistan border. Intelligence suggested they were being moved between compounds every 12 hours. Fast-moving mission, high risk, politically sensitive. Bryce Tanner was the acting operational commander. Even then, people knew what kind of man he was. The military produces 2 kinds of officers over time. Leaders people would follow into hell. And climbers. Tanner climbed. Every conversation with him felt calculated, every decision polished for promotion boards. Daniel saw through him immediately. He doesn't care about the men he told me once over instant coffee inside a plywood operations shack. He cares about headlines. I remember laughing quietly. "You just described half the Pentagon." Daniel smiled. "Yeah, but this one's dangerous." He was right. The mission went bad almost immediately. Bad intelligence, delayed surveillance updates, enemy numbers larger than expected. Standard military disaster. By sunset, our extraction timeline had collapsed completely. I was positioned on a ridge nearly a mile away, covering movement routes through my scope. Daniel's team was pinned near an abandoned compound while helicopters attempted to reroute through worsening weather. Radio chatter filled my headset nonstop. Confusion. Gunfire. Coordinates shouted over static. Then came the warning. I still remember the exact voice. "Lieutenant Harris, aviation support. We need immediate extraction now," he said. "Repeat now. Insurgents moving from the East Valley." Everybody heard it. Everybody, including Tanner. But Tanner delayed. Why? Because intelligence believed a high-value Taliban courier might still be nearby. Capturing him would elevate the mission from successful to historic. That's how careers get built. Daniel came over comms seconds later. His breathing sounded ragged. "We're exposed out here," he warned. "Request immediate pullout." Tanner answered calmly from command. "Negative. Hold position." I remember gripping my rifle so hard my fingers hurt. Daniel looked up toward my ridge through smoke and darkness. Even at that distance, I swear I knew exactly where he was. That's what happens after years with someone. You feel them. Another burst of gunfire cracked through the valley, then came screaming over comms. One Marine hit. Another wounded. Still, Tanner delayed extraction. I keyed my mic before protocol could stop me. "Command, this is Ironhawk. They need evac now." Silence. Then Tanner's voice again. "Maintain overwatch position, Commander Carter." Cold. Detached. Like men weren't dying below him. Weather worsened. Visibility dropped. Enemy trucks appeared along the eastern ridge exactly where aviation warned they would. Everything collapsed after that. The firefight became chaos. Daniel's team tried moving toward secondary extraction points, but they were boxed in from 3 sides. I fired until my rifle barrel burned hot through my gloves. 2 confirmed targets, then 4. Then more. Didn't matter. There were too many. And then, Daniel's final transmission. I've heard it in my sleep for 11 years. "Get the others out." Gunfire behind him. Heavy breathing. "Tell Evie." Static swallowed the rest. Then silence. The helicopters finally arrived 12 minutes later. 12 minutes. That's all. 12 minutes between life and death. 3 soldiers died during extraction. Daniel was one of them. The official report called it unavoidable combat loss due to deteriorating field conditions. Tanner received a Silver Star 6 months later. Promotion followed after that. Nobody asked too many questions because America was tired of war by then. Families wanted closure, command wanted clean paperwork. And grieving widows. Well, people prefer grieving widows quiet. I retired 14 months later. Couldn't sleep properly anymore. Couldn't stand briefing rooms. Couldn't hear helicopters without feeling sick. Most nights, I sat alone in our small house outside Richmond, listening to old voicemail recordings from Daniel just to hear his voice. Years passed that way. Empty years. Then 3 months ago, everything changed. A retired communications officer named Walter Green died in Arizona. Massive heart attack. Before he passed, he mailed a sealed package to Admiral Monroe. Inside were backup communication recordings from Lantern Pike. Original field transmissions, unedited. Proof Tanner knowingly ignored extraction warnings. Proof Daniel's team had been sacrificed for mission optics. Monroe contacted me 2 weeks later. At first, I refused to come. Then another package arrived at my house. No return address. Inside was Daniel's old sniper qualification badge wrapped in cloth. And beneath it, a handwritten note. 3 words, "Finish what we couldn't." I carried that note in my coat pocket now. Even sitting alone in that hotel room, I could feel its weight. Around 2 in the morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Commander Carter." Male voice, older. "Yes." Long pause. Then, "Ma'am, this is Sergeant Mike Donnelly." The name hit me instantly. One of Daniel's Marines. I sat upright. "Mike." "Yes, ma'am." His voice shook slightly. I heard Ironhawk came back. Outside harbor fog rolled over Norfolk. For the first time in 11 years. The ghosts were starting to come home too. Mike Donnelly asked if we could meet somewhere quiet. Not a bar. Not a base. Someplace normal, he said over the phone. I've had enough military buildings for one lifetime. So the next morning I drove west through steady gray clouds to a small diner outside Williamsburg. The place looked untouched since 1987. Chrome stools, faded pie display, country music low on the radio. A waitress refilling coffee like she'd been doing it since Reagan was president. Americans over 60 know places like that. Places where veterans sit alone at dawn staring into coffee cups they stopped tasting years ago. Mike was already there when I arrived. Older now, of course. We all were. His hair had gone mostly gray and arthritis had thickened his hands, but I recognized him immediately. Same square jaw, same tired eyes. He stood awkwardly when he saw me. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he hugged me. Tight. Like a son hugging family at a funeral. "Ma'am," he whispered, voice cracking, "I'm sorry it took me this long." I closed my eyes. It wasn't your burden to carry alone. But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. We sat near the window while rain slid down the glass outside. Mike stirred his coffee for almost a full minute before speaking again. "You know what I remember most about Daniel?" I shook my head. He always checked on the youngest guys first. Mike laughed softly through his nose. Every mission briefing, every convoy, didn't matter how tired he was. He'd look around and ask if everybody ate. I smiled before I could stop myself. That sounded exactly like Daniel. Mike stared down at his hands. He saved my life that night. There it was. The sentence hanging over both of us. He pushed me behind a wall before the second explosion. Mike continued quietly. If he hadn't... He didn't finish. Didn't need to. The waitress brought eggs and bacon we barely touched. Outside, tires hissed on wet pavement. Mike leaned closer. There are others willing to speak now. How many? More than you think. I studied him carefully. Why now? He looked embarrassed. Because we're old now. I frowned slightly. He sighed. When you're young in the military, you tell yourself survival comes first. Career first. Pension first. Family first. He swallowed hard. Then one day you wake up 63 years old realizing you spent 20 years lying to yourself about what kind of man you became. That one hit deep. Because age does something strange to people. It strips away performance. At some point, older Americans stop caring about appearances and start caring about whether they can still live with themselves. Mike reached into his jacket pocket and slid a folded paper across the table. Names, 7 of them. Former operators, pilots, communications personnel. Witnesses. One had moved to Montana. Another ran a bait shop in South Carolina. One was in assisted living after a stroke. Old soldiers scattered across America carrying the same guilt in different zip codes. I looked at the paper for a long time. Then Mike asked quietly, "You really gonna do this?" I thought about Daniel. About 11 years of silence. About Bryce Tanner standing safe behind medals bought with other men's blood. Yes, I answered. Mike nodded once. Then we're with you. Over the next 3 days, I drove hundreds of miles across Virginia and North Carolina meeting ghosts from another lifetime. Funny thing about veterans. You can go 10 years without speaking, then sit together over bad coffee and pick up conversations exactly where they stopped. I met Hector Ruiz outside his auto repair garage near Fayetteville. He walked with a cane now after 2 knee surgeries. "You still shoot?" he asked me. "Not much." He grinned. "That's probably safer for everybody." I met former helicopter pilot Andy Mercer at a fishing dock near Chesapeake Bay. Wind whipped his white hair while gulls circled overhead. "You know, Tanner called the delay acceptable losses afterward," Andy muttered bitterly. I almost punched him. "Why didn't you—" He stared at the water. "Because I had 2 daughters in college." Honest answer. Painfully honest. Another witness, Robert Gaines, lived alone in a small trailer outside Roanoke. Oxygen tank beside his recliner. COPD from years of smoking and burn pit exposure overseas. "I kept waiting for somebody else to speak first," he admitted quietly. That's the truth. Nobody judged him. Because fear ages differently inside every person. By Friday evening, 9 witnesses had agreed to testify. 9. More than Monroe expected. More than Tanner feared. And Tanner was afraid now. I could feel it. The harassment began subtly at first. Anonymous emails questioning my mental health. Rumors spreading that trauma had made me unstable. One retired officer even called to advise me against embarrassing the Navy publicly. I listened politely before hanging up. Same old system. Protect the institution first. Truth second. Always second. Late Friday afternoon, I visited Arlington National Cemetery alone. Cold wind moved through the rows of white headstones like whispers. Daniel rested beneath a maple tree halfway up a quiet slope. I hadn't visited in almost 2 years. Grief changes shape as people age. At first it screams. Later it just sits beside you quietly every morning while you drink coffee. I knelt carefully beside his grave. "I'm tired, Danny," I admitted softly. My voice sounded older than I remembered. I thought hatred would keep me strong. Wind rustled dead leaves nearby. But I don't think that's true anymore. For a long while I simply sat there. No dramatic speeches. No tears. At our age, grief becomes quieter than television makes it seem. Finally, I touched the cold marble lightly. "I wish you were here," I whispered. And for the first time in 11 years, I realized this fight wasn't truly about revenge anymore. Not completely. Revenge keeps wounds alive. Truth lets scars close. There's a difference. As I walked back toward the cemetery entrance, my phone buzzed. "Admiral Monroe." "You need to get back here," he said immediately. "What happened?" Long pause. Then, "They're arriving." "Who?" "You'll see." The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock Saturday morning, inside a secured Naval Administration building near Norfolk Harbor. When my car turned into the parking lot at sunrise, I nearly stopped breathing. Men stood everywhere. Older men. Veterans. some in wheelchairs, some wearing old dress uniforms stretched tighter around aging shoulders. One man leaned on a walker beside a Marine with prosthetic legs. More cars kept arriving. Dozens of them. I stepped out slowly into the cold morning air. Mike Donnelly approached wearing full Marine dress blues despite the rain beginning again. "You did this?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "No, ma'am." Then he smiled faintly. "Daniel did." One by one, the veterans turned toward me. And slowly, every single one stood up straighter. The hearing room smelled like old paper coffee and rain-soaked wool coats. By 8:30 that morning, every seat was filled. Not with reporters. Not with politicians. Veterans. Mostly older men. Gray-haired Marines sitting shoulder to shoulder beside retired Navy corpsmen and pilots who now needed bifocals to read briefing folders. Some carried oxygen tanks. Some rubbed aching knees every time they stood. And every one of them had come for Daniel. I stood near the back wall before proceedings began, quietly watching them settle in. There's something deeply American about old veterans gathering in silence. No speeches. No theatrics. Just presence. A kind of quiet loyalty younger people sometimes forget still exists. Admiral Monroe approached me carrying 2 paper coffee cups. "Black right." I accepted one. "Still remember." "I remember everybody who mattered," he said softly. We stood together watching the room. "You nervous?" he asked. I considered lying. "Yes." He nodded once. "Good, means you still care." Across the room, Bryce Tanner entered through the side doors surrounded by attorneys and 2 younger officers carrying files. Conversations immediately stopped. Tanner wore his uniform perfectly. Of course he did. Rows of ribbons. Polished shoes. Silver hair trimmed carefully. The image of military authority. But I noticed something immediately. He looked tired. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man who hadn't slept properly since hearing the name Ironhawk again. His eyes found me across the room. Held there. Neither of us smiled. One of his lawyers leaned toward him, whispering something. Tanner answered without looking away from me. Fear changes people. Especially powerful men unused to feeling it. At precisely 9 o'clock, the hearing board entered. 3 senior officers. 1 civilian oversight representative. Doors closed. Recorders switched on. And just like that, 11 years of silence began cracking open. The board chairman started formally. This hearing concerns operational conduct during Operation Lantern Pike, conducted October 17, 2014. Bureaucratic language? Clean language? Language designed to make tragedy sound organized. Tanner's attorney spoke first. Naturally. He called the renewed investigation emotionally motivated revisionism fueled by trauma-related memory distortions. I almost laughed at that. Amazing how often institutions label truth inconvenient only after widows start talking. The attorney continued for nearly 20 minutes describing battlefield confusion, difficult command decisions, and heroic leadership under impossible circumstances. Tanner sat upright beside him, nodding solemnly. Perfect officer posture. Perfect public face. Then witnesses began speaking, and the performance started falling apart. Mike Donnelly testified first. His hands shook slightly while taking the oath. Not from fear. Arthritis. Age humbles everybody eventually. He described the ambush calmly, methodically. Then he looked directly at the board. "Daniel Carter saved my life." Simple sentence, powerful enough to silence the room. Mike explained how evacuation warnings had reached command repeatedly. "How certain are you?" one board member asked. Mike answered immediately. "Because I heard Colonel Tanner acknowledge them himself." Tanner shifted in his chair. Second witness. Former pilot Andy Mercer. He described weather deterioration and repeated extraction requests denied from command. "Were conditions survivable?" the board asked. "Yes, sir," Andy replied, "if extraction happened when requested." Tanner's attorney objected constantly. Speculation. Incomplete recollection. Emotional interpretation. But facts kept stacking like bricks. One witness after another. A communications specialist testified official logs had later been edited. Another officer admitted casualty timelines no longer matched archived transmission data. And slowly, the room's atmosphere changed. You could feel people realizing they weren't hearing isolated complaints anymore. They were hearing a cover-up. By noon, Tanner looked visibly strained. Sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the cold room temperature. His attorney requested recess twice. Denied both times. Then Admiral Monroe called my name. I stood slowly. The room became perfectly still. Not because I was famous, not because of the call sign, Because everybody knew widows carry truths institutions fear most. I took the witness chair and raised my right hand. The oath felt strange after all these years. The board chairman spoke gently. "Commander Carter, whenever you're ready." I folded my hands together. For a moment, I simply looked at Tanner. And suddenly, I saw him clearly. Not a monster. Not a villain from movies. Just a weak man who valued ambition more than human lives. Sometimes evil is disappointingly ordinary. I was positioned on Overwatch during Lantern Pike. I began quietly. No dramatic voice. No anger. Just truth. I described the ridge, the weather, the radio traffic, the repeated warnings. Then I described Daniel's final transmission. My throat tightened slightly there. Not enough to stop. Just enough to remind me grief never fully leaves the body. "Did you personally hear Colonel Tanner refuse extraction?" the chairman asked. "Yes." "Multiple times?" "Yes." Tanner's attorney stood abruptly. Commander Carter's emotional involvement compromises objective reliability. Before he could continue, Admiral Monroe interrupted. "Sit down, counselor." Cold enough to freeze water. The attorney sat. I continued speaking, and something strange happened while I talked. The anger I'd carried for 11 years started fading, not disappearing, just loosening, like finally setting down luggage too heavy to carry anymore. When I finished, silence settled over the room. Then Monroe stood. "There is one final item for review." He handed a flash drive to the board technician. Tanner went pale immediately. Because he knew. The recovered recording. Walter Green's backup archive. The room speakers crackled softly. Then old battlefield audio filled the hearing chamber. Gunfire. Static. Shouting. And finally Tanner's voice. Clear. Undeniable. Negative extraction. Maintain current operational posture. Another voice shouted over comms. "Sir, they'll be overrun." Tanner answered coldly. "Mission priority remains unchanged." The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nothing except the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Then Daniel's final transmission played. "Get the others out." Static. "Tell Evie." Silence. My chest tightened so suddenly I almost couldn't breathe. 11 years. And hearing his voice still felt like losing him all over again. Across the room, one elderly Marine quietly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. The recording ended. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, the chairman turned toward Tanner. "Colonel, would you like to respond?" Tanner swallowed visibly. His voice sounded smaller now, thinner. I made the best decision available under combat conditions. Nobody reacted. No sympathy. No agreement. Just exhausted disappointment. Then Tanner said the sentence that destroyed whatever remained of him. Leaders sometimes have to accept losses. The moment the words left his mouth, I knew he was finished. Because every veteran in that room understood something Bryce Tanner never did. Real leaders carry losses. They don't calculate them. By the following Monday morning, Bryce Tanner's career was over. Not officially. Not yet, but everybody knew. Military scandals move strangely in America. The public sees headlines last. Long before television networks catch up, the truth travels through quieter places first. Phone calls, veterans' halls, golf courses outside military towns, diners near bases where old men drink coffee at sunrise. By dawn, retired servicemen across half the East Coast already knew what happened inside that hearing room. And by noon, reporters started calling. I ignored every one of them. CNN, Fox, The Washington Post, even some podcast host from Texas wanting the real Ironhawk story. I wasn't interested. People always think revenge ends with applause. But real revenge feels quieter than that, more complicated. I sat alone in my hotel room that afternoon, eating vending machine peanuts and watching rain slide down the glass, while news anchors discussed Bryce Tanner like they'd known him personally. Decorated officer under investigation. Questions surrounding battlefield conduct. Newly surfaced recordings. Strange hearing your pain summarized between pharmaceutical commercials. The television volume stayed low. Eventually, I turned it off altogether. Silence felt better. Admiral Monroe called around 6. Tanner submitted resignation paperwork. I leaned back slowly in the chair. That fast. The Navy wants distance before media pressure grows. Of course they did. Institutions protect themselves the same way old houses do during storms. Seal the windows, hide the damage, pray the foundation holds. Monroe sounded tired. "You all right?" "Funny question." I looked around the room. Half-empty coffee cup, wet coat hanging beside the heater, Daniel's old badge sitting on the nightstand. "No," I answered honestly, "not really." Long pause. Then Monroe sighed softly. Neither am I. We stayed quiet for a moment. After enough years, older people learn silence doesn't always need filling. Finally, he spoke again. There's going to be a recommendation board reviewing Daniel's actions. I closed my eyes. For what? Navy Cross. Emotion caught me off guard so suddenly I couldn't answer right away. Daniel should have received recognition years ago. Instead, Tanner got medals while my husband got folded flags and polite condolences. Monroe lowered his voice. I'm sorry we failed him. That one hurt worse because he meant it. I know, I whispered. The next few days blurred together. Veterans kept reaching out. Letters, emails, voicemails from men I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. One came from a retired corpsman in Arizona. Your husband carried me 300 yards with shrapnel in his own shoulder. Another from a Gold Star mother in Ohio. Thank you for making them tell the truth. That one made me cry. Not dramatically. Just quietly at the kitchen table of my hotel suite while cold coffee sat untouched beside me. Grief changes as people age. Tears arrive softer, but somehow deeper. On Wednesday evening, I attended a small veterans fundraiser near Virginia Beach because Mike Donnelly practically forced me to go. People want to thank you, he insisted. I didn't do this for attention. Doesn't matter. The event took place inside a modest American Legion hall with bad fluorescent lighting and overcooked roast beef. Real America. Folded flags in display cases. Old men discussing fishing. Women organizing raffles beside trays of cookies. The kind of place where patriotism still looks homemade. I almost left twice before entering. Then a young sailor stopped me near the doorway. Couldn't have been older than 22. Nervous expression, fresh haircut, dress white, slightly too stiff. Commander Carter. Yes. He swallowed hard. My name's Ethan Brooks. I waited politely. Then he said something I still think about. I was going to leave the Navy next month. That surprised me. Why? He looked embarrassed. Didn't trust leadership anymore. Fair answer. A lot of younger servicemen feel that way now. He glanced down briefly before continuing. But after hearing about your husband, he shrugged slightly. I don't know. Guess I remembered why people serve in the first place. Something tightened painfully inside my chest. Not rage, not grief. Something gentler. Hope, maybe. Ethan smiled awkwardly. Men like Daniel Carter are the reason people still believe honor means something. Then he shook my hand and walked away before I could answer. I stood there stunned. Because after 11 years of anger, some young kid in dress whites had just reminded me revenge wasn't the entire story. Legacy was. Later that night, several older veterans gathered around my table after dinner. Mike, Andy Mercer, Hector Ruiz. Even Robert Gaines drove 3 hours despite his breathing problems. At one point, Robert looked at me with wet eyes and finally said the thing all of them had carried for years. We should have spoken sooner. Nobody moved. The room around us hummed with quiet conversation and clinking silverware. I studied their faces carefully. Aging men. Imperfect men. Men who spent decades surviving wars, divorces, funerals, layoffs, illness, and guilt. I could have humiliated them. Could have reminded them silence helped Tanner survive all these years. But honestly, I was too tired for bitterness anymore. You came now, I said softly. Robert lowered his head. Still feels late. Maybe I admitted, but truth arriving late is better than truth buried forever. Mike wiped his eyes roughly with one hand. No one spoke for a while after that. Then somebody changed the subject to old military rations, and suddenly half the table started laughing about powdered eggs and terrible coffee overseas. That's another thing older Americans understand. People survive pain by remembering ordinary things, not just tragedy. Thursday morning official Navy statements finally went public. Colonel Bryce Tanner retired effective immediately pending further review. Commendations connected to Lantern Pike suspended. Additional operational findings under investigation. Carefully chosen language. Still enough to destroy him. Reporters camped outside Tanner's Virginia home by afternoon. Former colleagues disappeared. Sponsors withdrew from veteran charity boards he served on. His entire reputation collapsed in less than a week. And strangely, watching it happen didn't satisfy me the way I once imagined. Because no public disgrace could undo a cemetery headstone. No humiliation could return 11 missing years. Revenge closes no graves. That truth settled heavily on me Thursday evening while I sat alone beside Norfolk Harbor, watching cargo ships move through dark water. Wind carried salt and diesel through the air. An older couple walked nearby, holding hands carefully like people who'd survived many winters together. I watched them disappear down the pier, Then I looked out over the water and quietly said Daniel's name aloud for the first time in years without anger attached to it. Just love. Simple, painful, human. And somehow, that hurt less. The ceremony took place beneath a pale winter sky at Arlington National Cemetery. Cold wind moved through the rows of white headstones in long, quiet waves, carrying the sound of distant traffic from Washington and the soft rustling of bare trees overhead. The army band played low in the distance while families gathered near the memorial section. I arrived early. Old habit. Daniel used to tease me about that. Evie, he'd laugh, you show up 30 minutes early to your own birthdays. Funny the things grief lets you remember. Not the dramatic moments first. The ordinary ones. The way somebody laughed. The way they folded towels. The songs they hummed while driving. I stood near Daniel's grave wearing a black wool coat and gloves, watching veterans slowly gather across the hillside. More than I expected came. Mike Donnelly arrived with his grandson. Hector Ruiz wore dress blues despite obvious pain in his knees. Andy Mercer stood near the back beside several retired pilots' hands, buried deep in his coat pockets against the cold. Even Robert Gaines made the trip, pulling oxygen carefully before lowering himself into a folding chair. Old soldiers. Still showing up for one another after all these years. That matters, more than people realize. A line of younger Navy personnel stood nearby in formal uniforms, many of them too young to remember Afghanistan clearly. But they came anyway, because service has always depended partly on stories passed between generations. Stories about sacrifice, about loyalty, about who we choose to become under pressure. Admiral Monroe approached shortly before the ceremony began. He looked exhausted, but peaceful too, like a man finally laying down a burden. You ready? He asked quietly. No, I admitted. He smiled faintly. That's probably the right answer. For a moment we simply stood together looking across the cemetery. Thousands of white stones stretching into the distance. Entire lifetimes reduced to names and dates. Monroe cleared his throat softly. I visited Tanner last week. That surprised me. Why? He requested it. I turned toward him slowly, and the Admiral took a long breath before answering. He said he spent so many years convincing himself success justified everything. He stopped recognizing himself. I stared ahead silently. Do you pity him? Monroe asked. I thought carefully before answering. Number. That much was true. But after a second I added, I don't hate him anymore either. And strangely, that felt like freedom. The ceremony began at 11 sharp. Flags moved sharply in the wind while the chaplain spoke about duty, sacrifice, and truth. Then the citation was read aloud. Daniel Carter, United States Navy, awarded the Navy Cross posthumously for extraordinary heroism during Operation Lantern Pike. As the officer described Daniel holding defensive positions so wounded men could escape, I closed my eyes briefly. Not because it hurt, because I could see him clearly again. Young, steady, braver than he ever believed himself to be. The medal presentation came next. A young sailor placed the Navy Cross carefully into my hands. Heavy, warm from his gloves. For 11 years, Daniel's story had belonged to reports written by frightened men protecting careers. Now, it belonged back where it should have been all along, with the truth. Applause spread quietly through the crowd. Not loud, not theatrical. The kind older Americans understand best. Respectful, real. Mike Donnelly cried openly beside his grandson. Hector removed his cap slowly and bowed his head. Even Monroe wiped at his eyes once before straightening again. And standing there among all those aging veterans, I finally understood something important. Daniel hadn't disappeared. Not really. A person survives in every life they touched. Every lesson they leave behind. Every act of courage another person carries forward. That's how honorable men live beyond funerals. After the ceremony ended, people lingered in small, quiet groups across the cemetery grounds. Stories started flowing naturally. Funny deployment memories, terrible military food. Old arguments nobody remembered clearly anymore. For the first time in years, Daniel's name existed inside laughter again instead of silence. That mattered more than revenge ever could. Eventually, the crowd began thinning. Families headed home. Veterans walked slowly back toward parking lots and buses. Monroe stopped beside me near the maple tree above Daniel's grave. You disappearing again? He asked. I smiled faintly. Maybe not this time. He nodded approvingly. You spent a long time thinking isolation was strength. I looked down at the medal in my hands. Wasn't it? No, he said gently. Strength is coming back after pain tries to bury you. Simple words, but older people know simple truths often carry the most weight. Before leaving, Monroe shook my hand firmly. Then he paused. You know, he said there are younger veterans asking about you already. I laughed softly. That sounds dangerous. Maybe. Then he grinned slightly. But maybe this country still needs people worth looking up to. 3 months later, I stood alone at an outdoor shooting range outside Richmond just before sunset. Cold air, orange sky, the sharp smell of gunpowder drifting through pine trees. I hadn't touched a sniper rifle in years before recently returning to practice again. Not because I missed war, because for the first time in a long while, I wanted to live instead of hide. A younger woman in Navy training gear stood 2 lanes away, adjusting her scope nervously. Maybe late 20s. Focused eyes. Good posture. After a few minutes, she glanced toward me, then looked again. Recognition slowly spread across her face. Excuse me, ma'am. Yes. She hesitated. Are you Ironhawk? I almost laughed hearing the name spoken out loud again. For years, it felt less like a call sign and more like a ghost. Finally, I smiled. Once? The young sniper looked at me like people used to look at legends when I was younger. But I didn't want that anymore. Legends are lonely things. Instead, I nodded toward her rifle. Your breathing's too fast before the trigger pull, I told her gently. She blinked, then smiled sheepishly. Yes, ma'am. We spent the next hour talking quietly while the sun disappeared beyond the trees. And somewhere during that ordinary evening, I realized something. Revenge may begin a story, but healing is what allows it to end. So, if this story meant something to you tonight, if it reminded you of someone you loved, someone you lost, or someone whose sacrifice should never be forgotten, then share their memory. Talk about them. Keep their story alive. And if you believe honor still matters in this world, I hope you'll stay for more stories like this. Because sometimes the people history forgets are the ones worth remembering most.